All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the China Research Center public lecture on the myth of Chinese capitalism by an outstanding journalist and China expert, Dexter Roberts. This event is co-sponsored by Georgia Tech Cyber, that is Center for International Business Education and Research. I'm Hantao Lu. I'm a professor of history at Georgia Tech and director of the China Research Center. The center is an the center is an inter-university organization, provide a platform for China-related research and teaching in Atlanta and in the broad region of Georgia. The center is currently housed in the School of History and Sociology of Georgia Tech's Ivan Allen College of Liberal Arts. I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Professor John Mcintyre, to moderate today's event. Dr. Mcintyre is Professor of Business at Georgia Tech's Jerry College of Business. He is a founding director as well as the executive director of Cyber at Georgia Tech. John is an expert of a number of fields in business, including international business strategy, export-import management, comparative management, international technology transfer, international political economy, and other subfields related to the globalization of the management. So without further ado, here is Professor Mcintyre.
Thank you, Anchao Lu. And Anchai is very humble. He forgot to say that he's a distinguished professor of the history of modern China. Some of his books are vintage books, particularly his history of Shanghai. I'm John Mcintyre. I'm in the Scheller College of Business at Georgia Tech. I am director of the federally funded Center for International Business Education and Research. Our center has prided itself on really following the evolution of China for the past. Well, we were created in '93, so that's a long time. Probably not as long as our speaker has followed the evolution of China as a global power. It's a pleasure to welcome. What's that? Okay. It's a pleasure to welcome Dexter Roberts. His book was released, I believe, in the spring. The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, China's Troubled Transition from Factory of the World to Superpower. It's interesting to have him today because we usually have a very a view of China as an incredibly rapid transforming economy, but there are significant parts of China that are still very much what we would call a dual economy. That is to say, there is the one half of China that has stepped into the 21st century head first, has achieved great wealth, and has projected its power and its ability to export. China, the global factory. But there is also another part of China which we tend to underplay. And Dexter has the ability, having lived in China for 23 years as bureau chief for Bloomberg Business Week, having learned Chinese very early on in the 1980s at Stanford University, having traveled to all of the provinces and autonomous areas of China to provide a unique, in-depth perspective on the reality of China. And therefore, with great pleasure that I welcome him. He has agreed to talk for about 35 to 40 minutes. And then I will, as moderator, along with Han Shao, ask a few questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. We ask that you use the chat room to type out your questions, and I will moderate that and repeat your questions. We should be done by 12:30 Eastern Standard Time. Dexter is speaking to us from his native Montana. It's 2 hours earlier there. Dexter, the floor is yours, and I guess you will be sharing a PowerPoint with us in a minute.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much, John, and also Cyber, and also Han Chao, of course, from the China Research Center, I'm really delighted to have this opportunity. Unfortunately, I'm not in person. I would love to be in Atlanta to do this talk, but very delighted to have this opportunity to speak to you all virtually. And John, also thank you for the very kind introduction. I'm going to go ahead and start to share my screen here, I think. Here we go. And okay, I think you can see that. Am I right?
Perfect.
You can see my screen? Yes. So
Perfect.
what I'd like to do today is talk about really focus in on what, for lack of a better expression, I call the other China, and that is about half the country, made up of several 100 million migrant workers and their relatives in the countryside. And if you add that group together, again, we're talking about half of China. And what I would like to do is talk about how legacy policies, I call them legacy policies because they date back actually many, many years to the Mao era, Mao Zedong era, that today are both a restriction on the development of the lives of this other China, these some 500, 600 million people, and also are a substantial obstacle to China's continued sustainable economic growth. I'm going to talk today. Very kind offer to allow me to talk a little bit about my book, which is on this very topic. So I'm going to focus part of my talk on my book, and we've got, I guess, about 35, 40 minutes for me to speak and then answer questions. So we'll get into the topic at great depth. However, if you do find it interesting today, I do encourage you to get a copy of my book and read it, because obviously that is a much more in-depth treatment of these same topics. So to talk a little bit about the origins of my book, you actually have to go back to the year 2000, so quite a long time ago, 20 years ago. I had been in China at that point for about 5 years as a journalist for Business Week magazine. And 2000 was special for me as a journalist because it's the first time that I made it down to the southwestern and very poor province of Guicho, and still relatively poor today as well. And as you can see here, I worked on this cover story for Business Week called China's Wealth Gap. And that story was looking at a number of years already after Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening. We'd seen tremendous progress in the growth of the economy and in living standards, but we'd also seen a growing wealth gap, particularly between the coastal areas and the interior. And this, of course, was part of Deng Xiaoping's statement, some people must get rich first. So the idea was, let's start with the coast. By the year 2000, the then President and Party Secretary Jiang Zemin had become a bit concerned about that growing wealth gap and had launched a policy called Develop the West, which was an effort to try to narrow that gap, again, between the coasts and the interior, and also the cities and the countryside in China. So my first visit to Guicho in that year, 2000. That same year, I actually went to Guicho a couple times. The other was a cover story I did for Business Week. Well, here you can see it was called The Great Migration. It was about the already strong, several hundred million strong already migrant workers who were then really starting to leave in large numbers the countryside, going to the cities to work in the factories and on the construction sites that, again, were springing up everywhere as a result of Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening, and had been for over a decade. So I went back to Guicho again, and went and met these young people who had over the last 5 years left this small village in southwestern Guicho, or southeastern Guicho. Guicho is in the southwest of China. They're actually from a village in the southeastern part of the province, and had gone to work in the factories. So I met them in the city of Dongguan, which many of you will know is sort of the one of the most important cities in the Pearl River Delta for China's then growing export economy. And so they were working in as it turned out, it was a Taiwanese-owned electronics factory. Many of these young people from the same village, you can see three of them in the pictures here, were working in the same factory in Dongguan. So I look at my book and examine this question, which I then realized all the way back in 2000 that was very meaningful for China's future economic development. First of all, this gap, what did it mean for China? All the way back then, 20 years ago, why were China's leaders concerned about this gap? And what did this enormous migration of people from more poor parts of China into the cities mean for the future of China? And I really did realize during those visits and the stories I wrote in 2000 that this was important. A wise editor at the time told me, this is clearly an important topic. You should think about perhaps writing a book about the migrants and this gap in China, if indeed it continues to be important to China's future sometime later. And so it took me a long time, but ultimately what my book, The Book of Chinese Capitalism, is about. These two pictures here on the left is a typical factory scene. These happen to be workers between shifts. Is a more recent shot of that same village, which over the last 20 years, longer than that now, I visited repeatedly. I focus in on my book to examine this larger question of what the migrants and what the wealth gap and uneven development means for China on in particular these young people, then young, from the village, a village called Binghua in Guicho. And this is Mo Rubo. This is a picture from 2000. He was then working, again, as I said, in a Taiwanese-owned electronics factory, and he was a welder. At this point, he had already spent about 5 years. I think he was 21 then. He'd already spent about 5 years moving from city to city across China as a migrant looking for work. He'd worked in Shanghai, he'd worked in Ningbo, near Shanghai, and then he'd worked in a number of cities in Guangdong province before ending up at this factory. Another picture of this young gentleman, Mo Rubo, who I got to know very well, his then girlfriend on a city street in Dongguan. Another picture, I should say, these pictures right now are from a wonderful photographer named Greg Girard, who's done a tremendous amount of great photography on Greater China, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Beijing, and the provinces. And he accompanied me on these first trips that I took back in 2000 to this part of Guicho and also to Dongguan. This is a distant cousin of Mo Rubo, the welder. Her name is Mo Meitren, the young woman in the red vest. This is a picture from the village, which is called Binghua or Binghua Village, which I ended up spending so much time in. She had returned. I first met her in Dongguan several months earlier in Guangdong, where she was working. She had returned to her village because two things. She wanted to help her parents with the rice harvest. It was, I believe, the harvest time in the early fall. And she also had an expired identity card. Back then, it was very, very risky for these migrants to be picked up in the cities where they worked with an identity card that was expired. They could be thrown into what were then called these black jails and basically have to pay off the local police in order to be released. So she was back getting her identity card updated. Another picture from the village, some elderly and young people. Beautiful place, actually, even today. Today, they're trying to develop it as a tourist destination, and I hope they can do it because it is a beautiful, beautiful part of China and has this very distinctive wooden architecture, much of which is still there. So when I was there, again, it was 2000. I had already started to write for Business Week about this event, China's entry to the World Trade Organization, which was going to be really transformative in the development of its economy. And interestingly, the word had spread throughout the country, even into the small villages, that the World Trade, that China would be entering the WTO, and that this could potentially impact their future. So when I visited this small village in Guicho, the village party secretary, who I interviewed, talked to me a lot about their hopes that China's entry into the WTO, which was to come a little over a year later, at the end of 2001, would help transform his village. In particular, they were hopeful they would get a fruit and vegetable processing factory to start to sort of move up the value chain and away from subsistence agriculture. I should say the U.S. and China had signed the bilateral accession agreement for China to enter the WTO in 1999, and that was the last and the most important of these bilateral agreements that China had to sign in order to enter. So at that point, even though China had not yet entered, that was going to happen in December 2001, everyone knew that China was going to enter the WTO. In response, it was slashing tariffs on its industries. Interesting contrast to today, when tariffs are the principal weapon in the trade war that the U.S. and China have been engaging in. So tariffs were being slashed, industries were being opened, and over as I say here, over the next decade after China entered the WTO, there was this real transformative impact across the economy. $47 billion from $47 billion for foreign direct investment, that jumped to $124 billion a decade later. Thousands of small factories were set up, many of them by Taiwanese and Hong Kong businessmen across the Pearl River Delta. Tens of millions of more migrants left the villages and came to work in those factories and in the construction sites. So really, really transformative. Staying with some of the pictures of the cover stories that I did back then, this was on the China price. This was a few years later, and I just put this in because it's interesting. At that point, companies across the world, certainly in the United States, started to talk with fear about the China price, how they could not compete with the low-cost wages in China, and how of course, we were starting to see this hollowing out of industry. Of course, this has become very important today with efforts by the U.S. administration to bring the factories home, which is going to be extremely difficult. But this I just throw into it was a hint at what was to come. This fear of the China price. So, fast forward, this is a picture from more recent years, probably about 3 years ago, right before I left China, from Guicho province. And as I said, we saw this tremendous lift in living standards across the country. What had been this Develop the West program had focused a lot on starting to build infrastructure into the interior of China, expressways, high-speed rail, continued, of course, and certainly in the years as well since the global financial crisis, China embarked on even more infrastructure investment into the heart of the country, and that did bring wealth and opportunities to places like Binghuacun, this small village. Another picture of the Guicho countryside from recent years. That's one of the many very, very impressive expressways that now run through the countryside. If you can't see it in this picture, it's too small, but that enormous billboard, the fact that it's in gold and red is a clue. That's an enormous propaganda poster down there. I think maybe it's a line from Xi Jinping. I can't remember for sure, but that also came to the countryside. So fast forward all these years. What did we see? We saw, as I said, this great wealth through WTO come in part through WTO, a very important moment in China's history, start to really impact across the countryside. We did see living standards increase tremendously, and real progress. It brings us until today, when China is set to, they've set these very bold goals for their the centennial of the founding of the Communist Party, which was 1921. So next year will be the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party. They have set goals of eliminating absolute poverty. It looks like they're going to do that. They're going to succeed. They set a goal of doubling GDP between 2010 and 2020, and I think they've just accomplished that. They set a goal of doubling per capita disposable income, also between 2010 and 2020, and it looks like they're just narrowly going to make that. It's been a setback. It's been a little tougher because of COVID-19, but they're on track to do that. So the progress is undeniable. There's been this real transformation of the Chinese economy and of many people's lives. But I'd like to throw out one interesting, I think, illuminating statistic. When I first started covering the rural China, again in the late 90s, early 2000s, a number you kept hearing again and again was the gap between average incomes, gap between cities and countryside. And at that point, it was about 1 to 3. So the average incomes of the cities were about 3 times that in the countryside. That's about where they are right now. So despite all this progress, still today, that gap really has not been narrowed. And that was a clear priority 20 years ago in China, to narrow that gap. At the same time, we've seen really an explosion in income and wealth inequality in China today. I don't think everyone realizes now that China is one of the most unequal societies in the world. Thomas Piketty, the famed inequality expert, has done research on China that shows that the wealth gap in China today is pretty much comparable to what you see in Russia, which again is a bit surprising. We think of kleptocratic Russia having a big wealth gap, but not so much China, which is supposed to be a much more a country and a government that focus so much more on ensuring basic living standards and positive living standards for its people. Probably even more alarmingly, the growth in the wealth gap in China is growing very quickly. So they're moving in the wrong direction if indeed you think the wealth gap is a problem. So why is that? Obviously there has been this tremendous lifting of living standards, but why the wealth gap? And again, I argue back to my book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, The Worker, the Factory, and the Future of the World is the full title. I argue that gap, and I'm quite certain about this, is related, very directly related to 2 legacy policies, again, that date back to the Mao era, that today still hold back the living standards of this other China, about half of China. And those 2 policies are, first, and probably most importantly, the household registration policy, or the hukou policy. Hukou, depending on what scholar you speak to, either goes back centuries in China's history, and indeed they have had a system of household registration going back before the People's Republic of China. But what we see in today's China very much owes its origins to the Mao era, and particularly the 1950s, when Mao borrowed this idea of an internal passport system from Stalin, actually, in the Soviet Union. I think it was called the Propiska system in the Soviet Union. And at that point, Mao used that, somewhat ironically, for someone, a revolutionary who had said that they were building China. It was a proletarian revolution, and then, more importantly for China, a revolution, a peasant revolution. He created this system, or he strengthened this existing system, which had really fallen into disuse, to become a means to ensure that rural people in China stayed in the countryside. At that point, he was establishing the communes, and the reason for the household registration system was to make sure that they would stay there, and there would be a steady and cheap supply of food and grain for the cities, and particularly to help drive the industrialization of China, which again, somewhat ironically, was Mao's top priority, rather than trying to develop the countryside as much. So the household registration system, for many years, restricts the ability of people to move around the country. During the Great Leap Forward and the terrible famines that followed, that changed a bit. We did see people ignoring the restrictions and flooding into the cities to try to find food. But for most of the Mao era, that policy kept migrants kept China from having migrants, made it impossible for them to move around the country. One's grain rations, for example, were tied to your hukou. So you couldn't, if you went to the city, you wouldn't have food. So obviously that changed radically in the modern era, and particularly with Deng Xiaoping and reform and opening. So the hukou was relaxed to where it is today, where we have some 300 million migrants moving around the country, and they have that freedom to go seek new jobs in the cities. But it was not relaxed, and it was not done away with. And crucially, what the hukou does today is it ties the social welfare benefits of everyone to the place where they or their parents often were born. And that means that for your average migrant worker who's working in the cities, maybe a construction site, maybe a factory, or increasingly in the service industries, they are not able to access the same affordable health care as your average urban citizen who has this household registration specifically for the cities. They are also, in most cases, not able to put their children into affordable public schools, and often very good public schools in the cities. So that, amongst other things, contributes to what economists often call precautionary savings. Migrants, because of this uncertainty about their future, because of the possibility of high medical costs, when they do need to seek medical treatment in the cities, they often have to pay much more, often have to go to private clinics. Because of the costs of putting their children into schools, if they do bring them with them to the cities, they often have to go into private schools, which are not cheap and often of low quality. They tend to save more. So there's a very large group of Chinese that save a large proportion of their income, which is an obstacle as China, as we'll talk later, as China tries to move towards a more domestic consumption-driven economy. But the other thing, there's a human rights element to it. Because of that restriction on where migrants' children can go to school, many of them end up being what China has come to call left behind children. They stay in the countryside. They used to go to village schools. Now that typically they will go to these large impersonal boarding schools. I've been through a number of them as in my earlier years as a reporter, which sometimes look very impressive. China's government has put a lot of money into the infrastructure of building these big rural schools, but don't usually have very good education. Often they're living many students to a dorm, and unfortunately they often don't see their parents except once a year during the Lunar New Year. And this is all sorts of psychological issues. There's problems with lack of getting a proper diet, so there's physical issues as well with these migrant children, often several centimeters shorter than the kids in the cities because of poor diets, and with developmental issues as well. So terrible tragedy. This is a picture of the household registration, or the hukou document, which is like a little red, you can see here, a little red book, which notes down where you were born, where your parents were born, your ethnic status, whether you're Han Chinese or Tibetan or whatever you might be, your education level, and a few other details. The other big policy that I focus on in my book, which I think, again, is behind this dilemma that China faces today in better integrating the other half of China, is the dual land system. Again, a legacy policy of the Mao era, which means that whereas in the cities, urban residents are able to buy and sell and rent their apartments pretty much at market rates, and they do so. And this is not at all the case for rural people or the migrant workers who typically have a small plot of land themselves. The migrants will maintain a small plot of land back in the countryside. In most cases, they are unable to sell it or even rent it at market rates. And this is, again, because of this historical legacy. Mao defined rural land as belonging to the collective. Officially, it still belongs to the collective, which is a little bit ill-defined. But what it means is that rural village cadres do have power over the land. They are able to actually reclassify it or redistrict it from agricultural to commercial and industrial. And typically they would pay a farmer a very small fee, a nominal fee for the land, and they would turn around, reclassify it and sell it on for a very large amount of money, for a very large profit. And this difference between, this distinction between urban and rural land means that whereas we've seen an explosion of wealth in the cities, we haven't seen anything like that at all in the countryside. It's also behind probably the primary reason why we're seeing such a large and growing wealth gap in China today. So this is a picture of Mo Rupo. I'm in this picture, obviously. More recent picture. This is his wife. She was the young woman in the earlier picture, then his girlfriend, walking down the street. Here's their daughter. I think she was 5 at the time of this picture. They're living in a apartment that they rent in Dongguan, the Guangdong city, and they have a small business which they run out of their apartment, which is basically an athletic apparel sourcing company, and they have their own brand. Very tough business. So tough they've been unable to buy an apartment, which is in the cities. But at that point, that wasn't his main concern. His real concern was what he was going to do with his daughters, what education he was going to find for her. Because she was 5 or 6, she was about ready to go into primary school. He knew still today he would be unable to put her into the good private schools. The good public schools that are only reserved for urban kids in Dongguan. And so he was looking at different options. He already told me that he was absolutely not going to let his daughter become a quote-unquote left-behind child. He did not want to send her back to the village or the local township in Guicho, but instead he was going to find a private school. And as I said earlier, those are often quite expensive, certainly more expensive than public schools, which are typically free. And so he was struggling with that, that question of what he was going to do. So where are we now today in China? I guess first I'll say my book came out, as I think John mentioned earlier, in March of this year. I was in New York then. It came out on mid-March, and it was an interesting time to be there. Nowhere in my book is COVID-19 mentioned for obvious reasons. It went to the printers before we knew that COVID-19 and the coronavirus existed. But there I was in New York. It was an interesting time. New York was just waking up to the fact that there was a serious problem. Seattle, as we recall, was already aware of the coronavirus. So I left New York after doing a book launch that was a little less smaller than I had hoped for, but rewarding through the Asia Society. I jumped on a plane and left New York early. So although nowhere in my book is COVID-19 mentioned, I would argue that the issues in my book are actually only more relevant today. And why is that? Just a little background on where China's economy had been going even before COVID-19. For a whole variety of reasons, probably primarily the fact that China no longer is a low-wage destination. We've seen over the last probably decade this realization by the Chinese government that the old factory to the world model is no longer going to work. Many of the migrants have started to return to the countryside because they're not really welcome in the cities in most cases, as I talked about, and trying to sort of reinvent themselves as small businessmen or try to find jobs in the service industry in the countryside. At the same time, China wants to move from this factory of the world model to a much more domestic market consumption driven economy and a much more service driven economy. And this really, I would argue, is the biggest economic transition. This is the biggest economic transition, at least since China entered the WTO, and perhaps since Reform and Opening was launched by Deng Xiaoping. So what has COVID-19 done for this already important goal that the Chinese government has mapped out? It has made it far more crucial. The 2-year trade war plus the devastation that COVID-19 has wrought to the global economy has made it painfully clear to the Chinese government that they can no longer rely so much on the rest of the world and exports and investment at home to drive their economy, and they must move much more quickly to a an economy basically built on the spending power of its own people. We were talking right before we started our talk today. John and I were talking a little bit about something called the dual circulation strategy, which is the latest catchword of the Chinese government. This strategy basically is a recognition of that fact. China knows it can no longer rely on the rest of the world to drive its economy. It needs to figure out much more how to unleash the spending power of its own people. It's called dual circulation because that's a nod to the fact that China knows that it will always continue to trade with the world, but the clear emphasis now is much more moving towards a domestic-driven economy. And we've heard this from the very top of the leadership, certainly from Xi Jinping. We've heard a lot about the dual circulation strategy. We've also heard Xi Jinping over the last year talk far more about 自力更生, or self-reliance, and he's dusting off an old Mao autarkic era phrase there about the need for China to be self-reliant. So it goes beyond the consuming power of its own people, but also, of course, they want to be much more reliant on their own technology as well. So the reality today in China is with COVID-19, we've only seen this already real trend exacerbated, and that is the existence of a dual economy, or a bifurcating economy, where we've seen wealthier people do quite well. Particularly during COVID-19, we've seen a re-emphasis on the industrial economy, and we've seen lower income people do much more poorly. And again, if you look again over the first 2 quarters of the year, you'll see that whereas high-end goods are doing well now, as we've seen this recovery in China, things like luxury vehicles, smartphones, real estate has been doing very well. But if you look at mass market goods, they're not doing so well at all. And that's a reflection of the fact that if you look, for example, at the migrant workers, some 300 million people, we've actually seen a real stagnation in their incomes. I think in the first quarter, there was a pretty dramatic drop in migrant worker income, something like down 7%. And so we're seeing this, again, what I would describe as sort of this bifurcation of the economy that COVID-19 is exacerbating. China really, the government has sort of 2 paths forward at this point. And one, which I very much hope they take, is to realize that in order to unleash the spending power of this other half of China, they really need to finally start to reform some of these legacy policies that are contributing to the precautionary savings, contributing to the very high savings rates that we see across China, and are behind the fact that China, even today, only about 40% of GDP is made up by domestic spending. And this is something they've been trying to grow, again, as I said, for the last decade. Very focused on it. They really have made virtually no progress whatsoever in increasing that degree to which the economy is driven by the spending power of its own people. So one step forward, move more quickly towards radical reform of the household registration system, allow migrants to settle in the city and actually integrate themselves, allow them to bring their children into the public schools, allow them to have access to the healthcare system, so where they might be able to themselves access affordable quality healthcare in the cities. They might be able to bring their parents from the countryside to live in the cities then as well. And also move on the dual land system. Start to make it a system where not just the village cadres, but the villagers themselves and the migrant workers who have land are able to actually start to monetize that rural land. And I argue that would unleash a whole new wave of productivity in the Chinese economy, similar to what we saw after China entered the World Trade Organization and these once closed and cosseted industries were opened up to competition, private enterprise flourished. We could see a new burst of productivity that would lift growth and allow China to continue to sustainably grow. The other path, which unfortunately seems to be the one, at least until now, they are embarking on, is actually doubling down on these restrictive policies that prevent the other half of China from being better integrated into the economy. We've seen, and perhaps not surprisingly, greater resistance to migration from urban residents. I think there's a fear that they somehow would spread the virus or spread diseases as they come back into the cities. In the early days of COVID-19, the first quarter of the year, we saw actually urban communities where migrant workers had rented apartments, sort of putting up locking the gates, if you will. And in some cases, when the migrants came back, actually taking dramatic measures like shutting off their electricity and their water to drive them out of these neighborhoods. So unfortunately, we are seeing signs of a regression and a move towards even tighter controls over where people live. And that, I would argue, will ensure that China cannot make this a sustainable transition and will ensure that the economy continues to stagnate. I don't need to tell everyone here that that has enormous implications for the world. Countries and companies around the world have become very accustomed to the idea that growth in the China market will contribute to global growth or their bottom lines for the companies themselves. And that cannot continue unless they start to do these reforms and bring those people into the economy. I'd like to actually just stop here and start probably the more interesting part of today, which is the question and answer. So, John, I'd like to hand it over to you. Hi, John. Are you muted?
I am. I'm sorry. I had sirens in the background. Thank you very much for an excellent, exhaustive presentations. I really appreciate that. Your experience is invaluable to those of us who study China. I'd like to take the prerogative of the moderator to ask just a few questions. You give a picture really of winners and losers in the Chinese economy. Now, there are a number of datelines that are sort of uppermost in the mind of observers of China. 2021, the 100th anniversary. 2025, the attempt at creating 40% local content in all Chinese manufactured goods. And then 2049. Do you think the gap between the losers and the winners, between what is called the dual Chinese economy, rural China and urban China, can be bridged? You make a case. You identify a number of areas where action should be taken. Are you hopeful that this gap shall ever be bridged, or are we stuck with the same gap that existed in 1979 when Deng Xiaoping visited Jimmy Carter in the United States?
So as I was just saying, I very much hope that China does begin to take these steps to do away with some of these restrictive policies that have ensured that half the population remains as second-class citizens. They've been talking about it for a very long time, certainly since 2013, when they had another historic third plan. Obviously, the one that we all hear about is 1960. The third plan launched Reform and Opening. Well, in 2013, at the third plan of the party, they announced that they would make sweeping reforms to household administration and to the dual land system in order to do exactly what I've just described, unleash the spending power and make a more sustainable economy going forward. They have made very little progress in years. We've seen on the Guicho household registration piecemeal progress. We've seen pilot programs established around the country, very much top down, where the central government decides which cities will have the right to welcome more migrants and rural people to settle down permanently, and really not deferring to the migrants themselves, who, as in a more efficient economy and a more efficient system, would then themselves decide where the jobs were, and they would migrate there, and they would be able to integrate themselves and their families into the cities. That's not happening. If you look at the big showcase cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, many of the provincial capitals, they're actually becoming more restrictive. So they're moving in the opposite direction. Places like Beijing and Shanghai have set population targets which actually demand a reduction in the number of people. So they're actually pushing the migrants out. So I'm not very optimistic about that. The Chinese government will continue with some of these large priorities we've been talking. You mentioned Made in China 2025 is a key one. They will do their best to make that happen. I should add, that's not a new priority. I remember under the previous administration of President and Party Secretary Hu Jintao, they had something very similar they called indigenous innovation. And very, very similar. They had set targets to create domestic content for different technologies, and very much this goal of China becoming much more self-reliant. Well, that's still very strong. One of arguably the most important goals in China today is becoming reliant in technology, and obviously they know they have to do it. And the difficult relationship with the United States, the trade war, the actions against companies ranging from Huawei to TikTok to WeChat makes it clear to the Chinese government that they do need to push for this self-reliance. I think it's going to be very, very difficult. One thing I didn't talk as much about is the challenge of moving towards. They talk a lot about moving towards a more innovative economy, and obviously that's a key part of developing their own technology is being more innovative. The reality today in China, because of the household registration system, is that you have wonderful schools providing great education in cities like Beijing and Shanghai, and you have schools that provide very bad education in many cases in rural China. We are seeing a very high dropout rate of rural kids, and they're a significant portion of all the children in China, because those schools are so bad, because their families need them to help and they need to start working earlier. I don't need to tell all of you that you don't build an innovative economy on a very high dropout rate amongst your young people, and that's what China has today. Some of these statistics aren't reflected in the official statistics for a variety of reasons, but there's been really quality research done, including by Scott Rozelle at Stanford, that shows that there is a very serious problem with rural education in China today. So I'm not sure I've answered your question fully, but I think the goals remain the same, but the challenges are very substantial.
With the reshoring taking place to other parts of Asia, perhaps, and with automation of the Chinese juggernaut, can we expect more of the urban workers to go back to their original villages and rural settings? Can we expect that some of them will be reconverted in the service economy? And if so, which service sectors do you anticipate likely to provide employment for workers who have lost jobs in the world of factories?
Well, absolutely, that's happening, and there's official policy both nationally but also provincial and municipal level. Places like Dongguan that I write about in my book that they actually have a subsidy system for factories that the policy is literally called replace workers with robots or with automation. They give a subsidy to companies that get rid of their workers and put in automation. They have subsidies as well for local or Chinese domestic robot makers. So this is a very key part of the Made in China 2025 goal, and it's very easy to understand it. Some of the very impressive senior leaders in China. I'm thinking in particular now of Liu He, who we've gotten to know better through the trade war, and he's been Xi Jinping's right-hand person on dealing with the U.S. He has been very focused on this question of how to overcome what they saw in Japan, this hollowing out of industry, and their decision has been to try to so we don't have the cheap workers anymore, but we're going to keep the industry, we're going to keep the manufacturing, we're going to upgrade it, we're going to make increasingly sophisticated product. But we're going to have much more automated factories. So that is happening. We've also seen over the last couple years a very natural trend towards growth in the service industry employment. So now actually there are more migrant workers working in the service economy than there are in manufacturing or on construction sites. And this has been going on for a number of years. You ask a very important question: what will those jobs in the service industry be? The Chinese government, as is always the case, has a wonderful plan, at least on paper, about creating new higher value added service jobs. They have this idea that workers will leave the factories and they might do something, they would get a better paying job in software development or running e-commerce companies. It goes across the board. The reality today is most of the new service jobs are very low end. They're not high paying. They're often very unpleasant. The most obvious new service job that migrant workers are doing, and you can see this if you visit any Chinese city, is delivery workers. And so they buzz around the cities on motorcycles, often at very high speeds, because they're paid based on how many things they deliver, whether it's full meals. That's something many urban Chinese now rely on, is getting a hot meal delivered to their door from a restaurant by one of these delivery workers, or a package. It's a crucial part of the life of cities right now. It also, as I said, happens to be not very well paid and pretty brutal. There's been a huge surge in traffic-related accidents, including fatalities of migrant workers, because of the pressure to ever deliver at ever faster rates. So what we've seen, and there's great research on this as well through Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, a gentleman named Albert Park, looking at what the new service jobs are, and they are not, by and large, the higher value-added ones. They tend to be very, very low end. The other side of the picture, which you referred to earlier, is there's many migrant workers are going back to the villages. There's also government encouragement, punitive, the stick, where they're actually being driven out of cities. The schools that their children go to, the private schools, are being shut down often with under the pretext of them being not up to building codes or unsafe. But there's a conscious effort to push the migrants out of the cities. There's population targets often set that require reducing urban populations, and also the carrot, the positive side. There's big efforts to try to develop rural e-commerce, so that as these migrants go back to the villages, they can reinvent themselves as small entrepreneurs. The village I spent so much time in Guicho, as I said earlier, is really trying to reinvent itself as away from basically what was subsistence agriculture and an economy based on remittances from the young rural people going to the factories to work, to one that would be sort of an ecotourism economy. And they're trying to use e-commerce to attract urban people to come spend their money and stay in their lovely wooden traditional houses there in the village. So it's an ongoing process, but it's not working out to date exactly how the government would like it to.
Yeah. I have a number of questions, and I'm trying to sort of summarize them. What economic pressure will lead to reform by the Communist Party, reforms in some of the areas you have indicated, and relatedly, will the US-led trade war against China incentivize the CCP to install reforms? Or will it have the opposite effect, that is to say, tensing up and shutting down and closing up and being more aggressive?
Well, again, I mean, these reforms they're not a mystery to the Chinese government. They've been their smartest minds have been talking for years about the need to boost the proportion of the economy driven by domestic spending. And again, it's been stuck below 40%, right around 40% for the last decade and earlier, I believe. And so they know that the household registration system is a significant obstacle to boosting domestic spending. They know that the dual land system is as well. As I said 7 years ago, they announced with much fanfare plans to reform these. There are really substantial obstacles on the other side that explain the slow progress. I mean, for the household registration system, there is the perception, perhaps correct, that integrating these migrants and their families and more rural people into the cities is going to be exorbitantly expensive. Under the Chinese system, the localities themselves are responsible for paying the social welfare costs of their citizenry. So cities themselves would have to pay the extra costs of providing higher quality health care and education for migrant children in the cities. And there's been pushback from those cities who say, where are we going to get the money? The other big issue, sadly so, because it's unpleasant to watch, is resistance from urban people themselves. And if you look at some of the protests we've seen in Chinese cities in the last few years, a number of them have been by urban parents, parents of children, have children there in the cities. They have the household registration for the cities, and they've actually protested against well-meaning efforts by the central government to try to integrate more migrant children into the city schools. So basically you have urban parents going to the local Ministry of Education and protesting and saying, do not let more children into these schools. You can sort of understand it's already tremendously difficult to get your own child in as an urbanite with urban household registration into the best schools in the city. Now the central government's telling you we're gonna add a large number of kids from the countryside. Well, those parents have actually protested against that. On the land policy, the dual land policy, you've got a situation where the localities are deeply reliant on the proceeds from land sales to pay the bills. So up to, depending on what research you look at, up to half of local government revenues come from land-related sales. And real reform would mean taking a large portion of that money and redistributing it to the people in the villages and in the countryside. And that means China needs to find a new source to pay for local expenses in the municipalities, in the townships, and so on. So those are very substantial obstacles. Externally, I think the trade war, again, as I said, I would hope that China knows that it has to make this transition to a more domestic-driven economy. I would hope that it would put pressure on the government to pursue these reforms that they already know they need to take, and find a way to overcome these challenges and allow this other half of China to be better integrated into the cities.
Is there anything major trading partners of China, like the U.S., Japan, or the European Union, can do to ensure that reforms occur? Or is China totally resilient and unresponsive to pressure? And similarly, do foreign organizations have any latitude in helping to fill the gaps you have noted, the gaps in education, nutrition, and the like? Or are we looking back at days way past?
Yeah, well, to your second question, they have a lot less ability to do that now than when I moved to China, and they have a lot less ability to do it now than 2013 when Xi Jinping took over. There's been a massive, I think many of you will know this. There's been a massive constriction of civil society. It's not just foreign NGOs or organizations that have been squeezed out of helping out in China, but any sort of non-government affiliated NGO is facing a much more difficult environment today. I saw it, and I write about this in my book, in the labor sphere.
Yeah.
There was at one point, pre-2012, a flourishing ecosystem of small labor NGOs, much of it centered in Guangdong, much of it done by former workers who were idealistic and wanted to help their colleagues in the workforce, which has basically been completely suppressed under the present administration. So there's a lot less room. I don't know if everyone knows, but I mean, getting foreign funding for an NGO in China now is extremely risky. And it's been made very clear that if you get that foreign funding, you can be shut down, you can be accused of somehow colluding with foreign forces. And that's something that any NGO that wants to survive in China today, they need to make sure very clearly that they're not getting any money from overseas. And they need to make that very clear, most importantly, to the local government, or they can get in serious trouble, which I saw in the labor sector in particular. So I think there's a huge challenge for any sort of foreign participation or even independent civil society participation in trying to deal with these problems in China today. I think in terms of what the U.S., for example, can do from a distance, I I'm a firm believer in strengthening people-to-people exchanges. What we're doing right now in the U.S. appears to be severing them. With the end of the Peace Corps, two examples, the end of the Peace Corps program in China, the end of Fulbright fellowships in Hong Kong and China, these I think are absolutely misguided moves. One thing we can do is try to some of the repercussions, some of the actions taken against Chinese students who had until today studied happily in the United States, now finding they can't get visas, I think again are deeply misguided policies. I think even in the absence of necessarily a good Washington-Beijing relationship at the higher levels, it's important to maintain these people-to-people exchanges. Now, I'm not trying to apportion blame here, and I certainly think that on the Chinese side, they're making it increasingly hard for us to have people-to-people exchanges. I'm also mindful of the fact that legitimately we have to, an example in the technology sphere, we do need to keep a closer eye on our technology here in the United States. And the very large presence in the U.S., the strong relationship in the past has been abused, I think, in some cases, in terms of trying to get access, for example, to our technology. But back to your original question, I think that we should try to rebuild some of these people-to-people exchanges, even as the relationship at the top continues to look not very good.
Which leads me to a question that was raised by two members of our audience. What will be the impact of the U.S. election? Of course, it's a very hypothetical question. Would a defeat of the current government, current administration, change the nature of the evolving U.S.-China relationship?
Well, the short answer is no. I think the tone of a new administration, a Biden administration, possibly in Washington, the tone of the bilateral relationship could shift. It could be a little less antagonistic. I think the underlying issues are going to continue to push against a real, a move back to where we were before. And I mean, I think there's a little of a tiny bit of credit to be given to the present administration to rethink some of the issues of the relationship. I think there were some things that needed to be rethinked. I think the way the bilateral relationship has been managed on this side has been very bad. And I don't think that's been helpful. But I do think there's been a need for sort of a rethink of what's happening, more consciousness, again, as I said earlier, of things like technology theft. And I think those issues will continue to be just as live and just as important in a future administration. I'll say one more thing. When I went to China in the mid-'90s, I immediately started, China was on its way into the World Trade Organization. I was working for a business magazine. I was always writing about the challenges that American companies, in particular as an American magazine, faced in China. And those challenges, poor intellectual property rights, forced or coercive technology transfer, an unlevel playing field, unclear regulatory system, which tends to too often favor the local companies. Those were the issues that I was writing about, and every American company would talk to me about. Those are exactly the same issues we're facing today. And that's a measure of, unfortunately, the lack of progress. And the last thing I would just say is, we may have a change in administration in Washington, but it doesn't look like we're going to have a change in administration in Beijing. And of course, Xi Jinping has now made it possible for him to stay as long as he would like. And he's very ambitious and idealistic, and I think he has no intention of leaving. And I think that also makes it very difficult for us to expect any significant improvement in the bilateral.
We had a question regarding Chinese workers moving to developing countries, particularly in Africa, but elsewhere. Is this a trend that will pick up, in your view, and can it alleviate some of the labor issues that China is facing?
I think it could, it's already fairly substantial. Big Chinese, particularly state enterprises, are often like to bring their whole workforce with them. That's, I should add, created frictions in the host countries where they've invested when those countries have discovered that the big Chinese investment is not bringing in as many local jobs as they had hoped for. But I do think it will continue. Obviously, we have the Belt and Road Initiative, which is facing challenges because of COVID-19 and the continuing issues in the domestic economy in China. But that is a priority of the top leaders, and particularly of Xi Jinping, which means it will continue. It's also very much a political initiative, not just an economic one. So that desire for China to have a much larger footprint, both economically and politically, globally, will continue. And that will mean more Chinese workers going abroad. I don't think that the numbers are significant enough for it to have a real impact on dealing with unemployment issues, for example, in China. I just don't think that's possible. We still have a workforce or working age group in China of almost a billion people. So 16 to whatever it is, 60 years old in China is almost a billion people. It's actually started to shrink very slightly because of the demographic changes, but it is huge. And if you look at the number of Chinese workers overseas, it's very small.
The policy of one-child family has been put aside, I believe. Can you say a few words about that? Because many of us are not clear on that.
Yeah, so several years ago, it was pretty much abandoned in most cases. The problem is it seems to be too late. So what we've seen is initially there was a little baby boom bump, I think the first year after they loosened it, which was maybe 4 years ago, if I remember correctly. But the reality is today in China, certainly in urban China, you've seen people reach a level of income and education where they have no desire to have large families. And you also see, as I mentioned earlier, tremendous challenges in getting your children into good schools, both not just for rural people, but for urban people. And that has been, I've done a lot of reporting in the past on the one-child policy and some of the reforms. You talk to parents, and inevitably, one of the first things they'll say to you is, you have no idea how much it costs to raise a child in China today. And by the way, even for the urban parents with their kids in the public schools, as no surprise to many of the people listening today, those kids don't think, they don't get out of public school and they're done with their studies. They spend significant hours every week after school on the weekends in these private cram courses, whether it's English, mathematics, Chinese, very, very important, and they're very expensive. So you hear again and again the cost of raising a child as being a significant obstacle to having a larger family. What we saw after that first year baby bump is no progress. They're not getting the demographic dividend that they hope to get out of loosening that policy at all.
Shifting grounds a little bit, we're seeing an extensive use of U.S. export controls directed at China. Of course, export controls coming out of the Cold War in the 1940s, 50s, now being reused to deal with Chinese technology leads, particularly Huawei, among others. Do you expect that the Chinese state and the Chinese innovation machine will be able to overcome the U.S. export controls designed to really guarantee that China does not gain military advantage in its civilian technologies?
Well, they're certainly going to try their best. And as I said, these goals of developing their own domestic technology go way back, at least as far as Hu Jintao, and actually much earlier under Jiang Zemin. They've been trying to do this forever, and they're going to continue, and they're going to put all the resources they have of the government behind it. I do think the export controls are extremely damaging for China and make it much, much more difficult. We've seen, with just for example, with Huawei, we've seen a substantial impact on their chip business through their subsidiary, and now we're even seeing an impact on their smartphones. Apparently, they're not doing well. And I think it's going to be very difficult. The U.S. is trying to twist some arms around the world and get other countries to join in, and that doesn't always work. But it's becoming a little bit easier, I have to say, given the way China is sort of this wolf warrior diplomacy and some of the aggressive moves we've seen, whether it's in India, whether it's in crossing, the PLA Air Force crossing the midline in the Taiwan Strait, whether it's in the Senkaku Islands near Japan. We're seeing sort of a less need for the U.S. to do arm twisting and more willingness by other countries to sort of join forces, and in some cases with these export restrictions. So I think Germany is the big outlier, which has a very close relationship with China. There's a very strong movement in Germany now and concern about whether or not Germany's sort of given away its technological crown jewels. I, in my book, spent a lot of time covering and speaking to both the CEOs of a Chinese company called Medea and the German robot maker KUKA, which was acquired by this Chinese company, Medea, a number of years ago. And it's a very troubled relationship, I would say, today. I spoke to the CEOs of both companies repeatedly over a number of years. So there's sort of an awareness even in Germany about the costs of not being more careful with their own technology. So the other issue, just quickly, two things. I mentioned earlier, the education system is a substantial obstacle to creating a more innovation-driven economy. The great inequalities across the education system, which we see. The other big issue, which is an interesting one, is an aging population. China has, it has a rapidly aging population, and there's been interesting research that shows that aging populations don't tend to do very well in innovation. And so that's something that China is going to have to deal with going forward. How do you innovate as your workforce gets older and older? So I think there's real substantial challenges. I don't, back to your original question, I don't think China can do this alone. Its technological growth until today has been built on a robust exchange of people and money and technology across borders. And I think they're going to continue to need to do that.
There is a lot of observers who consider that the new generations in China, noting, of course, as you just said, that China is an aging population, but that the new generations in China will pressure the current government to institute reforms much more rapidly than a lot of observers have anticipated. Do you put any credence in that notion, the so-called new generations, which we're seeing emerging all over the world, actually? The millennials and so on.
First I just start with an observation. For years, the assumption of outside observers watching China has been that basically the urban middle class, as they become wealthier and more educated and more knowledgeable about the world, will become a source of pressure that pushes the government to change. And we did see a history of these so-called NIMBY, not in my backyard protests in the environmental movement, for example, in China, where people in the cities would organize when a new waste incinerator facility was built near their apartment or something. And as a journalist in China, as an American journalist, for years, there was this sort of not terribly well thought out assumption that real political reform would follow economic reform, and that rising living standards, particularly amongst the educated people in the cities, would drive change. Well, we've seen that really hasn't happened at all. And I would say that a big part of that is because of this unwritten bargain that the party, which is the government of China, has had particularly with its urban people. And it is, we will continue to guarantee rising living standards for all of you, and you will not, demand things like a free press or real accountability of the party in all cases. In some cases, they do want accountability. And it's worked very well until today, particularly in the cities. It's less clear about what's happening amongst migrants and rural people. There's very interesting research that looks at satisfaction levels of people across China that looks at three groups: urban, migrants, and rural. And not surprisingly, the urban people register the highest level of satisfaction. The migrants are less happy than the people in the cities, which makes sense. They're not making as much money. They can see that the system discriminates against them. But interestingly, the rural people happen to be more happy than the migrants. And that's even though the rural people are making less money. And that's because they probably aren't as aware of the inequities in the economy. So what I'm saying is, I think I think that we were wrong to assume that the well-educated urban, maybe younger class was going to drive real change. I do think, and I've seen this in growing protests and I spent a lot of time over the last years, over the last couple decades with migrants and workers, and I do think there is a growing awareness of the fact that the system does not, is basically built against them, and people are upset about that. There are labor protests, no secret to all of us who watch China all the time in China, even given the rather formidable power of the Communist Party to monitor and control them. So I'm not answering your question. I do think that China runs the risk of a real stagnation of its economy going forward if they don't actually pursue some of these reforms. And I think then sort of all bets are off in terms of whether this bargain between the party and the people can continue to last. Or whether people will start to push back.
So to go back to the question, the impact of powers outside of China, US, Japan, Germany, and so on, do you think that more controls, less collaboration, less reliance on Chinese products will indeed break the bargain between the Communist Party and the people at large? That is to say, moving China from an export-driven economy to an internal consumption economy. Does it have the resources to do that and maintain that social bargain you have described in your book?
Not without reforming the household registration and the dual land policy. I don't think there's any way around that. They need to change those policies, and they need to figure out a way to bring the other China into the economy. They're reaching a situation right now where the middle class, which has been growing in leaps and bounds for many years now, is sort of running up against a wall. And there's sort of this assumption that magically, particularly amongst foreign corporations, I would say, that have been reliant on the Chinese economy, that somehow the middle class will just keep growing. It can't keep growing as long as they maintain this system that they have in place. I think that they, as I said earlier, if they did take this bold step of trying to deal with the challenges that are legitimate and real that would come with reform, but actually started to carry them out, they could unleash a new wave of productivity in the economy, which would allow them not to say goodbye to the world, because that's why they have a dual circulation strategy. They want to continue to have a relationship with the world, but re-emphasize it so that it focuses much more on its own people. They would be able to do that. I would say the fear I have is that if they do not reform those policies, we could see a situation where almost a diversionary tactic by the government, where they do things they've done well in the past, try to fan nationalism, for example, to get people to focus on political issues and get people to perceive that they're being victimized by the rest of the world and not by the party, and they could actually become more bellicose beyond their borders, as we're seeing already in places like the South China Sea. We certainly saw in the approach to Hong Kong with the national security law that they decided that politics in command, to use an old Mao era thing, they knew that what they did in Hong Kong would hurt the economy. They knew that it would bring more protesters on the streets, and they made a determination that they were willing to accept that in order to clamp down even more. And I should say, that's an interesting example, because if you talk to mainlanders in China, they have almost zero sympathy for the people in Hong Kong. It's very popular. It's a very clamping down on the Hong Kong protesters is a net win internally within China. People look at it and say, those ungrateful Hong Kong people, they were colonized by the British. They've grown on the backs of our economy, and now they want to do that. So it's a popular policy to sort of clamp down in Hong Kong. Similarly, I think with Taiwan, frighteningly so.
I kind of hear you as saying, and I want you to correct me, that China is sort of, the CCP anyway, if not China, is caught between a rock and a hard place. The rock of the external world closing up or becoming tougher with China through a variety of measures, and the hard place being the inability to institute reforms that would really propel an innovation-driven, quote-unquote, more democratic society. And perhaps the way out is being more aggressive externally. I don't know.
I fear that could happen, and what we've seen, I think, over the last 6 months is not encouraging at all. We've seen much stronger willingness to retire the old Deng Xiaoping dictum of, whatever, keeping your head low and biding your time, whatever the phrase is. That's not Xi Jinping's style. That's not the present leadership style. They've made a determination that this is a point when China needs to much more forcefully pursue its global interests, even if it does lead to, example, in the case of India, to fatalities and fighting. So I do worry about that. I would say that the other element in this, between the rock and the hard place, it's not just the U.S. and the rest of the world sort of clamping down on China. The other sort of insoluble issue they're dealing with is the reassertion of ideology throughout the Chinese economy, which is being pushed from the very top of the leadership. That doesn't work. You can't have all your private enterprises be twice as answerable to the party, which is what Xi Jinping reiterated 3 days ago, that the private entrepreneurs had to spend a lot more time not on making money, but also on establishing closer relationships with the party. I think that we see that sort of reassertion of ideology throughout the country. We see it in the education system, younger and younger children being told that they have to memorize the latest political sayings and so on. I'm very familiar with that through friends and relatives, you see it amongst the journalists in China. You see it in politics, but you also see it in the economic sphere. So I think that's the other rock that they're dealing with. I don't think they can push this sort of reassertion of ideology throughout the system and actually find a sustainable economic path forward.
Okay. Thank you very much. We're getting close to the end of the hour. And I would really be remiss in my job as a moderator if I didn't ask you, what is the possible next book you might consider writing?
Well, thank you. Thank you for asking. It's early stages, but I'm actually very interested in focusing my next book on looking much more at the business side. And my last story, of course, was really focused on this, for lack of a better expression, the other China, the people of China. I would like to look a lot more at what a company is in China today. We've got, as I said, a reassertion of the party, not just in the state sector, but also in the private sector. So I'll just leave it at that. I'm interested in digging more into that question going forward.
Thank you very much. We have reached the end of the time provided for the lecture, so I want to really thank you very much. I hope you're having great weather in Montana, that the smoke clouds from out west are not really towering over your sky horizons. And also want to thank our colleagues from the China Research Center, Han Chao Lu and Penny Prime, who I think joined us from New York upstate. I'm not sure. But in any event, thank you very much. That is the end of the hour. It's been videotaped, so it should be accessible at some point with your agreement, Dexter.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
You can close the meeting. You are in control. Thanks again, Dexter.
Thank you.
All right. Thank everybody for participating, and thank John and thank Tiff, and have a good day.
Thank you, and ciao.